Just wait for everybody's audio to settle in. Ben, you're all good?
Good, yep.
All good to start?
Yes.
Kia koutou, ia hui mai nei, tēnā koutou katoa. Hey everybody, welcome to this session. Hey, my name is Aaron Wano from the National Library of New Zealand. I'll be chairing this session on behalf of Te Upoko of Te Ika a Māui, the LIANZA Wellington Committee. Just to start with a karakia. Tu tawa mai I runga, tu tawa mai I raro, tu tawa mai I roto, tu tawa mai I waho. Kia tau ai te mau ri tū, te mau ri ora, kia tau, kia te kātou. Hui tai ki e. It's my pleasure to introduce Ben. Ben Chapman. Ben has degrees in physics from Victoria University of Wellington and has worked in the library for 4 years as a UX developer, working on its front-end services, driving innovation and knowledge delivery and discovery. Ben previously worked as a webmaster at Rare Disorders New Zealand and as a freelance web designer developer. In this session, Ben will talk about the highlights of the UX New Zealand Conference 2022, held in February, and give us a talk he delivered at the conference, building a new paradigm for search to allow for discovery and exploration. There'll be an opportunity to ask questions at the end, where you can virtually raise your hand and I'll call on you, or please use the chat function through the session for Ben to answer the questions at the end. Ben, it's around a 30-minute presentation.
Yes.
Yeah, and then some questions and discussion. So over to you, Ben, and thank you.
Thank you. Kia ora koutou katoa. Ko Ngāti Pākehā te iwi, e noho ana e mahi ana au te whanganui ātara. I raro e te maru o te ahumarangi I te taha o ngā wai o te whanganui ātara. Ka mihi au ki te mana whenua te rohi nei. Ko Ben Chapman tōku ingoa, ko te kai whanake whia ko whakamaki ahau I te pātaka kōrero o te herenga waka. Nō reira, tēnā koutou katoa. Well, thank you all for coming and listening to me. As you heard, my name is Ben Chapman. I'm here in Wellington, where I work at the library at Victoria University of Wellington. And at the library, my role is UX developer, which possibly needs a quick explanation, as UX is the topic I'm going to talk about today. So UX simply stands for user experience, and it is pretty self-explanatory. Like I said, there's going to be a quick explanation. So as a UX developer, I'm building online systems, websites and catalogs and the like, that provide users with the best experience that I can manage. In days past, my role would have been called web developer or front-end developer, but these days there is a much greater appreciation that it's not enough to simply build a website. It has to be built to be usable. And the field of UX has really exploded. So as a UX specialist at the library, I've been attending the UX New Zealand conference. And this is a fantastic conference. So we're so lucky to have it here in Wellington. It only runs for 3 days, but it attracts some great speakers from across New Zealand and from overseas, with great talks about design and websites and apps, like developing micropayment systems in Africa, or the psychology of color, employing te reo Māori, te ao Māori in developing health support services, or fixing countdowns online shopping experiences. It's all very exciting. But attending my first couple of conferences in 2019 and 2020, I wasn't finding a lot that was directly applicable to my work at the library. A lot of it was general enough to be helpful, but I felt the conference was missing our perspective. So after 2020, I pitched an idea for a talk to the conference organizers, and perhaps because of this fresh perspective, I was chosen to speak at the 2021 conference. They only gave me a very brief spot as a beginner speaker, just 15 minutes. So the conference was scheduled to be on in February 2021, but that was quickly changed to November. We all know the reason why. And it was postponed again until February 2022. So February 2022 was all ready to go under Orange, under a mixed model where there would be live speakers in Wellington and other talks given remotely, exactly the same way they ran it in 2020, actually, when we were first impacted by COVID. But then, of course, we went into red, and they had to quickly convert the conference to an entirely online event. And I will admit that at this point, about a month or so out from the conference, that's when I actually started to prepare my talk. After the conference, I put together a summary of the talks for my workmates here at the library. And that pretty much is what I'm going to present to you today. And then following that sort of summary of the conference, I'll give you my own 15 minutes or 10, 15-minute talk, pretty much as I gave it at the conference. Okay, let me share my screen then. I hope this works. What is this one? Okay, you might have to tell me what you're seeing. Are you seeing my slide, UX New Zealand 2022? Yep. Awesome.
You're good, Ben.
Excellent, cool. Run my back on my other screen. If I keep on looking over to the side there, that's because that's where I've got my display showing. I'll try to keep my attention here. Okay, where am I? All right, so even with all this disruption and change of dates and model, the conference was still quite enormous in New Zealand terms at least. So these are all the people who spoke or gave workshops at the conference. And this is a list of talks given on the Thursday and the Friday. And there's me just after lunch on day one. So it's a packed schedule. There was more than 20 talks over 2 days. And looking at this list of talks with all the variety in it, I found it really hard to see how I could summarize a conference or even pick out any dominant themes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at these 5 talks that happened before mine on that first day and assume that these are sort of representative of the rest of the conference. And then following that, I'll give you my own talk. Okay, so here's the first talk, the design of policy and the policy of design. And what a way to start a conference, eh? It's policy design. It's a subject everyone is hanging out to hear about. Actually, to be honest, the conference started with about 5 minutes of silence while they tried to get everything working. But then this guy, Phil, spoke about policies. And the first thing he talked about was terms and conditions, those awful, unreadable documents that everyone just accepts without reading, and how they can be rewritten to be actually readable, or how they can be sort of worked into the app that they apply to itself, perhaps as part of the onboarding. But policy design isn't just about the policy documents. It's also about designing the policy itself. So policies are sets of rules for what people can do, or what they should be doing, and how they will be doing it. So applying human-centered design to a policy means making that policy easy for people to work with and to make the policy easier on people. So actually, this subject is much more interesting than the title and that horrible slide design really suggests. My realization, listen to this talk, is that maybe design can just make anything interesting. So the UX design in this case is not designing an app or a website, which is what most UX design is. It is about designing a real-life experience. And there were actually a couple of other talks that sort of broke the mold in this way. On day 2, Kelsey G from the Department of Corrections gave a talk about redesigning the visitor rooms at prisons where children come to meet their fathers. This was a great talk. It was really inspiring. And she obviously cared so much about the positive impacts of the work she was doing. The subtitle for her talk is Design's Role in Shaping Mana-Enhancing Social and Systemic Change. And that was exactly what she was going for. Using design to not just make things better, but to make them sort of truly uplifting. Oh, and another talk on designing real life experiences was this one, the very last talk of the conference, which everyone was really keen to hear. And this talk promoted the idea of cutting the working week down to only 4 days while still paying the same amount and getting the same level of productivity while greatly increasing worker satisfaction. So approaching that as a design problem. This is an idea that has been around for a while, and I think its time may have actually come. This talk demonstrated that it's been successfully implemented in many places. So I think the case has been made. And if this was widely adopted, it could be transformational. But that's possibly a talk for another time or another venue. Okay, so the next talk on that morning was given by a UX researcher analyst who spoke about her time doing research in Afghanistan and Somalia in the barrios of Brazil. She was literally on the front line in Afghanistan. She started her talk with an anecdote of having bullets hitting the roof of a building as if it was rain. So this is a genre of talk about applying UX work in places where the stakes are huge and possibly life-changing. In this case, for humanitarian work in a war-torn country. And in Brazil, she worked with Uber, finding a way for slum dwellers to pay for transport when credit cards are uncommon and carrying cash is potentially dangerous, as well as the fact that many places don't have proper addresses. And in this talk, I found it quite amusing to see a photo of a board covered in fluoro-coloured post-it notes set up against a wall in a corrugated iron shack in the forward operations post in the mountains of Afghanistan. So another talk about solving real-world problems where the scale of the problem is seemingly overwhelming was this one given by a bunch of Kiwis in Britain who helped set up the massive COVID testing service where they tested millions of people, trying to test the entire country over a ridiculously short time, setting up these vast testing stations and hangars full of these tiny little testing booths. Now, this was actually the second talk that they gave about this, and the first one they gave in a mini-con in November, and that was all about handling the stress of doing such a huge, high-impact project. Moving on then, the third talk was about object-oriented UX, and this is back to the more familiar territory of app and website UX design. Object-oriented UX is an approach that this woman, Sophia Prater, has developed for breaking down the UX needs for a project and then rebuilding it with nicely designed components. I think she's made a career out of selling resources describing this technique. And she demonstrated this with a few examples. And in her examples, everything was flawless and the technique looked foolproof. But we all know very well that when confronted with a real-world problem, no technique can be used just out of the box. There will always be complications that require workarounds. And particularly for techniques like this one, where at each step, you can't proceed until every component interlocks and works together. But it was still great to see this demonstrated. Now, I think I'll be definitely going back and seeing what I can learn from it. So talks like this about the techniques of UX formed the bulk of the conference. This one was about UX design and information architecture, but there were also talks about content creation and UX writing, testing and analytics. And in addition to these talks about the practice of UX, there were a few talks about managing UX and UX teams within organizations. This talk is about re-ops at TradeMe, which would be research operations, all about recruiting people for a UX research team and ensuring that TradeMe workers outside that team are helping with that research. It's a very worthy topic. And I think many other people at the conference got a lot out of it, but to be honest, I found it all a bit dry. Okay, so the last talk before mine was this one about accessible design. Now, I did a short course on digital accessibility last year, and this talk was really, really good. Hit all the points that course made about how necessary accessibility is and how designing with accessibility in mind, which of course means designing for people with disabilities, just leads to better design for everyone. It's a really good talk and a great summary of the importance of accessible design. And there were a few other talks about inclusive design at the conference. This one here really struck a note with me. This one was about putting together an app for supporting people with their mental health. And this was a good talk, one of those case studies where the process from the project brief through to the delivery of the app is described. But the main point about this talk was that to properly do user-centered design for this app meant engaging with users were having or have had negative mental health experiences. So it was a real challenge to get usability information without potentially re-traumatizing the users. So it required a really careful approach. It was very interesting. I'll add a quick summary of this talk as well, as it also relates to the idea of inclusiveness in the design space. This talk was given by the directors of a Maori-led design studio. And they had a lot to say about the challenges of working in an industry where Maori are generally underrepresented. But the main point was that if you want to use, say, Maori graphical motifs, or if you want to target a Maori audience, you really need to have Maori involved. So for Pākehā like myself, no matter how culturally competent you think you are, you just don't have the important insight. And a great example I gave was designing communications for encouraging Maori to get vaccinated. I think this was around Rotorua. And they were just able to speak to that community in the most appropriate voice. And they also spoke about culture-centered design, which was really interesting, with a focus on human-centered design, which in itself is a very important approach. You can tend to quite deliberately make assumptions about shared experiences and backgrounds, whereas culture-centered design forces you to pay attention to the differences between people. Okay, so I said I'd talk about 5 different talks before doing mine, but I've ended up talking about 10. So hopefully I'm giving a fairly good summary of the range of the conference this year. Okay, now let me give you my talk, Seeking Better Search. Okay, but before I do, I just want to emphasize that this talk was written for UX professionals. So not necessarily for librarians. And also to make my subject a bit more immediate, I'm giving the sense that I might be working on developing some great new catalog search system that is going to revolutionize information science. So just to take that with a grain of salt. Anyway, I started my talk with my pepeha, as I did earlier, introduced myself as a UX developer here at the library. And at the library, as a UX developer, one of my key jobs is to take our various vast repositories and archives of information and make it easier for people to get that information out. And the way people look for information in the library is still the good old catalog. And here is our catalog. It's needing a bit of a spruce up perhaps, but not entirely unlovely, I hope. So in our catalogs these days are much more than they used to be. With most of our collection now being digital, the catalog doesn't just show you where in the library you can find that item, but will take you directly to the item itself in most cases, as well as giving you access to many other sources of information and knowledge that we subscribe to. And the search functionality is much improved over the old drawers of cards. And catalogs generally use a so-called faceted system, where you can drill down to an item quite precisely by filtering your search by multiple categories. So there's nothing surprising here. This is what you'd expect a catalog to be doing in this day and age. I think you'd be disappointed if you weren't getting this search experience. However, in the UX research we've done at the library, looking at our students and academics' use of our catalog, we've consistently found that there is a cohort of users who are choosing to go to Google Scholar rather than using our expensive catalog and discovery system. And here is Google Scholar doing the same search and getting only slightly different results. So as the person responsible for delivering the best user experience for our catalog, I have to ask myself, why are some people choosing Google over our system? And what can we do to make our system more appealing? And this is where my journey into search started. So let's take a bit of a look at modern search. Okay, so we all know that searching isn't simply about matching keywords with their occurrences. Behind the scenes, the search engine is ranking the results based on its mysterious algorithm, with the goal of directing you to the result with the very best fit to your search, based on any number of factors, such as popularity, relevance, credibility, as well as your own search history. So algorithm-powered search can be extraordinarily powerful, and the better the algorithm, the better the search. Now, I won't get into the details of search algorithms, you'll be pleased to know, but instead I'll quickly talk about a couple of examples that illustrate some of the developments in search algorithms. So a search algorithm relies on data, and there is an intriguing example of data that is somewhat open to the public. If you're a Netflix user, you'll know that their library is divided up into categories or genres, much like an old video store. And as well, there are subcategories. Myself, if I'm browsing, I'm inclined to think I'll find movies that I like in the crime thriller category. However, it's not enough for Netflix to know what subgenres users are watching. They need much more fine-grained detail than this. So that crime thriller that I just watched, did it also feature romance? Was it based on a novel? Was it produced in the 1960s? So to be able to more precisely categorize movies, Netflix did this wonderful, rather deranged thing. They created ever more specific genres, micro-genres, tens of thousands of them apparently. Now, it might have been a little bit subtle, but I've changed the screenshot on the slide to show some of the more wildly specific genres. So the matching between these micro-genres and the viewing history of people who have watched the same shows as you all come together so that Netflix can tell you what you should watch next. And while there is a human process going on here, with the genres chosen by actual humans and being meaningful, I mean, I'd watch a movie from any of these micro-genres, except maybe the sentimental movies about horses. But I would never browse these as categories. They only really exist as data points for the algorithm's machine learning. Now, sadly, I think Netflix have actually wound back this strategy and instead just apply multiple, more general genres to each movie. And also, for all this effort, I could scroll through Netflix recommendations for ages and not find something I want to watch. Which brings me to my next example. So of all the attention-begging platforms, TikTok probably has a reputation for being the most able to pinpoint a user's personal likes, quirky though they may be. The app has been described as being able to almost read minds. Its recommendations are so creepily intimate. Users have reported that TikTok is able to look deep into their own past or discern things that they keep secret, such as medical conditions, or reveal things about themselves that they weren't aware of before TikTok pointed them out to them. And TikTok is able to do this because a TikTok user can consume so many videos in one sitting and interact with them. TikTok learns about you, not just from which videos you choose to watch, but which ones you don't watch and which ones you only watch partway through. All of this builds a psychographic profile of you, not just as a user of TikTok, but as a person, as a personality, which is then used to recommend more videos. Anyway, so I hope these examples give you a sense of the level of innovation and progress in the field of algorithm-based search and recommendation. So in this slide, I've listed a few attributes of modern search. Search is precise. That is the whole purpose, to shave off the less relevant information to get to a good hit. And it is learning how to be better by refining its data and how it uses it. I've noted here that it is conclusive, by which I mean a search basically has an endpoint where you have found what you want or close to it, or perhaps you didn't find it, but at any rate, the query is resolved. Search is also becoming increasingly personalized as it gathers more personal data and gets better at analyzing it. And it is increasingly seamless. You may have noticed that the two examples I gave of Netflix and TikTok, you are being served up hits without actually having to search. Okay, so Google Scholar is really accurate. And that's what my search has to compete with. Though in fact, having set up this comparison, I don't actually mind too much if people are using Google Scholar. I want them to get to the content. And if Google does that for them, then that's okay. Perhaps I should be letting Google do what it does best, and instead think about what my search can do that Google doesn't. Look, all of these positive points about modern search, they apply for the kind of search they're set up for. But this kind of search only addresses one need when it comes to search. Is what we might call lookup search, where you're trying to find something, some information, an answer to a question. But this is not the only need when it comes to search. The other need is not to find something, but to discover something, or build up a collection of information or knowledge. This is a search where the goal is not necessarily certain when you start, but might become more apparent as you search. Here you are not trying to narrow your search down to one item or several ranked items, but you may actually want to be broadening your search. A fairly straightforward example of this in the academic field is a literature review, where you're trying to gather a collection of reliable sources covering a subject. Or consider this example, where you have received a diagnosis of a medical condition for yourself or a family member, and a search for information about this might cover details about the condition, as well as treatments, support services, information about medication. And sometimes the information you gather might work together as a whole, such as financial data and information to support your investment portfolio. This new type of search, exploratory search, directly contrasts with lookup searches, where a lookup search ideally wants one perfect result. Exploratory search wants a fuzzier range of results. Exploratory search relies less on algorithm recommendations and more on user browsing and interpretation. And an exploratory search may be an ongoing search, returned to again and again, refined with new information. Now, one aspect of lookup search that doesn't have a clear analog in exploratory search is seamlessness. And I'd like to return to that a bit later. So how will these contrasting aspects of exploratory search look like when built into a system? Well, let's have a look at them one by one. So the presentation of the results requires a rather different approach to lookup search. To begin with, the deep filtering to narrow the focus to a few good results needs to change, as you may need to gather a wider range of results. And turning the focus result into a broad result will require an approach of maximizing relevant hits rather than minimizing irrelevant hits. Also, less importance should be given to ranking results. Some sort of ordering is inevitable, but the search algorithm shouldn't be deciding for the user how they should be measuring the quality of the results. including semantic information, allows the connections and relationships between hits to be understood. I've noted here that query expansion can be used to broaden a search, whereas in lookup search, it is usually used to clarify. And by query expansion, I mean where the search function will present you with suggested alternatives or corrections to your search terms. Moving on then to how the search is managed. So while the user should have more control over the search, some sort of evaluation of relevance has to be performed by the algorithm in coming up with recommended results. But then the user can browse amongst the results or the filters and can adjust the search, which may cause it to evolve. I see this as a kind of a dialogue between the data, the user, and the results. And the findings of the search may prompt the user to fire up a new search on what was found in that first search. As I noted before, an exploratory search may be ongoing, so a search needs to be saved. Not just the results, but the state, including all the filters applied and other context added. And it can be helpful to keep the search live so it can be updated as the source information changes. Okay, so all of those aspects of exploratory search have been implemented in some ways, most of them probably. And you may have recognized them in systems that you've interacted with. Even things like e-commerce systems allow you a good deal of exploring. And in fact, I could probably do very good exploratory search just using the various tools that are included in our catalog. The biggest issue with exploratory search as an alternative to lookup search is that lookup search is just so easy and so seamless. The challenge for exploratory search is to become easier, more intuitive, and to be as frictionless as possible. We need to UX the shit out of it. I've put up a few examples of how I think progress could be made. Firstly, I'll note that there have been several standalone search systems that take an exploratory approach, but they all eventually wither away from lack of use and end up just pointing to DuckDuckGo. So I think a good approach is to offer an exploratory interface as an adjunct alternative to a lookup search, rather than a standalone system, or as augmentations to a lookup search. My next bit of advice might seem flippantly obvious: to provide context-sensitive advice on how to enrich your search. But if the algorithm could look ahead to the benefit of a certain change in the search parameters, exercising some insight, and then feeding that back to the user, then that could be hugely helpful. Okay, so to break away from the paradigm of a ranked list, exploratory search could use alternative presentations, including visual representations to emphasize that clustering of results. And there are many ways the interface could be innovated. And lastly, couldn't some of that effort that has gone into looking inside users' heads instead be used to help us understand how a person might explore? I don't know, that might not actually be a very welcome suggestion. So there we go. That is exploratory search in a nutshell. And as always, you finish my talk with my contact details so people can get in touch with me for more information.
Cool, thanks, Ben. Appreciate the time. I think something about designing policy to make it easier, that really calls to me. Are there any questions for Ben? I noted there's none in the chat, but if people want to raise their hand or just ask Ben.
I'm still sharing, aren't I? Can I stop sharing by hitting that?
No, you're good. I think, yep. Yeah. I could see the hands now if there's any hands.
Mm.
Okay, I guess my question then, Ben, is library kind of content presentation to non-librarians, I guess. So what kind of feedback did you get? What was the sense? Did you get anything that you thought, oh, that's...
So my talk was very short, so there wasn't actually a lot that was said during it. And I have to say that having mentioned TikTok and its ability to read people's minds, that sort of distracted a lot of people. So a lot of the chatter that was going on there, and when I gave it here at the library, they all wanted to talk about that. But I did get some suggestions for exploratory search systems to look at, which is really good. I mean, there are plenty of these things out there, and some of them are tools which I might actually adopt and incorporate into our catalog. Not so much from the UX conference, right? I did get some responses like that, but here at the library, I was pointed to a couple of tools, which I think I can actually sort of make use of. And giving a talk as a librarian was great because I did manage to dig up possibly the only librarian focused person coming to the conference who wanted to know more about the UX research that we did. And so I've sort of corresponded with her. She was in Australia, and so she might be enhancing their catalogue in a similar way that we have.
Cool. Thanks, Ben. I guess the benefit from this session, Ben, is that for me at least, you put the UX conference on my radar, right? I don't work in that space, so I know it exists now, which is a plus. But the content from that conference, so it was in February, wasn't it? Is that publicly available or only available to the people that registered for that conference?
So the conference is run by a company here called Optimal Workshop. They are a sort of a UX research and UX design tools company. So that they run that conference, and they have a YouTube channel. So they put out all of the talks from every conference onto YouTube every year. So that, I mean, I go back to the talks in 2019 and 2020 quite often to look at them just for inspiration and to learn various things. The 2022 ones they're not putting out in the same way. They're doing them a bit more. Well, I think what they're doing is that they're taking a theme and then they're making a blog post about that theme and uploading the videos to YouTube and embedding them in that blog post. So they are coming out, but not even half of them have come out yet, even though the conference was in February. So they're sort of holding on to that, not holding on to it exactly. They're sort of emphasizing it in a different way by tying it into some of their communications.
I'll keep an eye out for that. And one last question, if I'm greedy, unless there's any other questions, guys. You talked about your role is making it easier to get information out of the system. So I work for a team that collection management. So our mandate is make material available and accessible for future generations. It's not something you can measure. You know, you can do the job and it's a great job, but it's not measurable in some ways. But for you as a UX developer, what would that look like? You make some changes to your front-end services in the thought that this will make it easier to get information out of the system. But how do you measure that?
Well, I mean, all our systems are tied up with various analytics services. I mean, Google Analytics for our websites, but our catalog runs on Alma, and Alma has its own built-in analytics there. So you could very quickly see a change in behavior by making changes. We did the UX research, which I referred to in my talk, was we went out and spoke to some of our users and got the data that way, just to make sure that people were. It was kind of a preliminary work to see how people got into our catalog and what was the first step they took. So knowing if they're making best use of it, that's the next step of our research. But it was actually going out there and talking to people, so not necessarily getting quantitative data, but getting people's impressions. And then once you get into a room together and start putting those up in Post-it notes, the patterns emerge. It's quite fantastic.
All right, let's.
There was a question in the chat actually.
Oh, awesome.
From Simon.
My bad. My chat thing's on my other screen, so I actually didn't see it. So, Simon, sorry. Ben?
Okay, so the question is, how do you bring your library colleagues on board with your processes and findings? So I joined the Victoria University Library in 2019. After that, had a bit of a, I don't know, maybe Natalie and Ivy could talk about this a bit. I think they sort of just not discovered UX. There's probably making it sound like they were ignorant before that, but they definitely had the sort of UX drive of wanting to, just find out from users how the library could be improved. Well, not even just about the online stuff, which I'm doing now, but just the library in general. And so my role was created with that in mind. So there was some enthusiasm for that in the library, but I think people enjoy being part of this process as long as there's not too much hard work involved. This research that we did into the use of our catalogue was really, really fun to do. We got a bunch of volunteers together and we sort of sat around and made up those questions and the tasks that we were going to want people to do. I mean, wasn't keen to go out and actually interview people myself. That's something that sort of scares me a little bit. But the library assistants were quite happy to go out and take these cold interviews with people. So that, yeah, and then once you're able to then make the case for the changes that you want to make, with that research, the leadership team is quite keen to move your ideas forward. Hope that answers the question, Simon.
Cool. Thanks, Simon. And sorry, really greedy. We think about library careers, right? And I can certainly see a thing where the library careers are moving away from the traditional roles. And I say this loosely, like Catalogue, acquisition librarian that I am, etc., etc. UX developer, we see that change now. So I think something around the skills you picked up, your process to get those skills, qualifications. And if you could, how do we get to where you are if people are keen to be a UX developer?
To be a UX developer, yeah. So UX developer, it's a tiny fraction of the UX field actually. UX is more about design, but and UX research as well. Sorry, Aaron, trying to think about how I start this. I mean, my own journey to this. I started as a web developer. I mean, that's something, a point I made earlier, right? I mean, that was just my job description. You're building websites and systems like this, but you know that people are going to be using them. So as they come together, you want to know that you're engaging people. So I've worked at Rare Disorders New Zealand for a good 10 years or so, making numerous websites for all these different groups of people who someone in their family was experiencing a rare disorder. So they were all quite different in their needs. And so all of the websites had to take that into account. So I was building user-focused websites for a long time without even knowing that UX existed as a field. So I didn't even really twig that I could call myself a UX developer until I actually got a job with that title here at the library. But I've been doing UX for many years. Like many of these things, I mean, UX and so many things are really, really obvious when you're doing them, but you have to kind of be exposed to it to be sort of turned on to it, but to realize that it's the importance of that approach. But I mean, UX is something you can find a lot about it. It's a really, the field has exploded. So there's just a lot of literature about it if you want to look into it. Oh, and if you're inclined to go to this conference, I really recommend it. I mean, it's just a really, really well-run conference, as you can imagine, a conference run by designers. Yeah, and everything is really interesting, and they get some of the best talk speakers from overseas talking about user psychology and stuff like that. And I actually think some of the best talks are the ones where they talk about the terrible mistakes they made and how that made them better UX developers. One guy added this function to Facebook that everyone assumed was in Facebook was listening into things you were doing and factoring that into their algorithm. That was never his intent, but discovering that as this massive failure that he made just made him a much better UX developer and was able then to build this theory around that.
Is it best to go to the conference? Because I know it's physical and virtual, isn't it? Do you have any preference? What's best?
I would have much preferred to have gone to it in person. So I went in person in 2019, and whenever that was the only option. In 2020, because I was in Wellington, I was able to go in person too. But about half of the talks in 2020 were given online, and that was fine. I mean, I think watching one online is okay, but presenting and just not being present with other people, I was missing out so much. You have lunch and morning and afternoon tea together and get coffee, and so there's a lot of opportunity for networking, and it's just did not happen in this 2022 conference, not until the last day. They had this sort of virtual chat room set up where you can go in and talk about people, talk to people about what they've just spoken about, but they always seem to be empty until that last day when I sat for half an hour chatting with people, in that sort of post-conference euphoria. Yeah, so I mean, I'd go in person. So if it is run in person again, because I don't know what they plan. They're actually talking about doing smaller mini conferences throughout the year. So I don't know if they're planning to do another big one or if that's going to be an addition.
Thanks, Ben. Hey, just there's another question in the chat too from Simon.
Yeah, how is your working transferring into the physical library? So I'm not entirely sure, Simon. The physical side of the library is the client services approach, but the client services have themselves adopted various UX approaches, and so they are often talking to the clients directly for different reasons. I'm just not really quite aware of what they're doing. In terms of physical changes to the library, I don't know. I mean, the library is changing all the time. It's full of books which are getting less and less used. And that's not my work so much. That's not a UX work, but that's just the evolution of libraries. That the library itself is becoming more of a study space than a place to research.
I can probably just talk about this briefly, if that's okay, Ben. I was in client services when we were doing some UX work, and we did quite a lot of interviews, and we also did some mapping of the physical space and how students and staff were interacting with the space, which was really interesting. And it sort of gave us another lens to sort of look at how things are set up and whether we could set things up in a way that's more convenient for our users. Yeah, that was quite an interesting exercise.
Yeah, I think one of those important things about UX, one of those obvious things about UX, once you know about it, is that if you're not doing any UX, if you're not doing any research into users, you know nothing concrete about what they want. But once you've asked one person, you've learned 80% of what 80% might be exaggerated. You've maybe learned half of what you need to know about that subject. You ask 2 people and you're up to 75%. 3 people, you're up to 80%. So you know, it just takes a little bit of engagement to get information that changes the way you see things.
And building up that feedback was really useful, because you can say, oh, 10 people are saying that, you know, they much prefer it when the staplers are over on this side. You know, it's even something as small as that. And suddenly everyone goes, oh, okay, well, you know, obviously that's a good thing to address.
Oh, kia ora, Ben. Hey, thank you for your good effort, and appreciate you taking the time and to come and share your knowledge about the conference and also what you presented at the conference. It certainly sounds a fascinating thing to look into. Just as a side, I've done I tested some internal affairs systems at National Library, and you get opportunities like that. And they gave me a bar of chocolate after that. I'm just wondering, maybe that's the way to get people in to come and test your systems, or not. But I certainly enjoyed the chocolate, or the team did, I should say.
I think so. I think if you're going to go out and ask people, you need to reward them with something. We get them coffee vouchers, I believe.
In that case, let's just wrap up and with the closing karakia. Kia horo te marina ki whakapapa ponamu te moana. Hei hua rahi mā toto I te rangi nei, araha atu, araha mai, tato e tato katoa, hui taihiki e. Thanks, guys. Have a good rest of the week. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.